night. We never no, because there was so much going on right out here off of Plum Island, this whole coast.
Do you remember the date of this?
No, I don't.
1941?
It was, yes, it was before I went in the service. You asked me how I happened to go in the service. Well, you can see how involved I was.
Well, let's get back to this Ipswich
Yes,
fight.
well, as I say, we had the red light, and immediately I had to throw that main switch, and I called on that phone, and I swear, in a minute and a half, that biofuel square was just full of wardens and fire department and the electric company, and all standing, waiting. Well, we didn't know at the time why, but we knew something was wrong. And we also were well aware that we were under siege all the time out here. So many people said, well, it's lucky no one ever came on our coast. That's what they think. I had a cousin who was a captain in the Coast Guard, and he came down to see us one day, and he said, if the people along here knew what was going on out there, he said there'd be a mass evacuation from the coastline. And you wouldn't know it until oil started coming in, where they were blowing up ships out here. The subs were all out here. It was bad. So anyway, they had, at that time, Ipswich Neck was simply a summer place. Now, of course, they lived there all year round. So the cottages and the houses were all boarded up. Well, they had a woman, at that time she was in her 60s, and she lived in one of those cottages that overlooked the bay, all boarded up, apparently, for the winter. She was in behind all those boarded up windows and everything, and they had furnished her with infrared binoculars and so forth, so she could see at night. And she was watching that bay, out there all alone on that point. I think she showed great bravery. They did honor her afterwards.
Do you remember her name?
No, they never gave her name.
Oh.
No. So, come to find out, she was watching that bay, and she saw something coming in, Ipswich Bay, up near the, coming in where the Ipswich Yacht Club is now. So she watched it, and up comes the submarine. And so she had contact with the Army and the Navy, the Coast Guard, the whole works. They went down there in the dark, everything, they just moved right in. And they got down behind the sand dunes and the cottages and everything. You'd never known they were there, and they were watching, see what they were doing. So they put some men in a rubber boat, and they started rowing to shore. Well, they were greeted by, okay, that was it. They just popped up from behind, and the anti-aircraft guns were all in on that point, and they fired at the sub and knocked the conning tower up, and they couldn't submerge. You see, they had come in those days they had to recharge their batteries. They didn't have the atomic. And so they had come in there where they thought there was no one. They were going to recharge their batteries, go back down again and do their dirty work out at the sea.
This was a German sub.
There's a German sub. They captured them, and they spent the rest of the war in Portsmouth. There was quite a few prisoners in Portsmouth.
Is that right? That's interesting.
Yeah. People didn't know that they were that near. And
Did they come real close to Plum Island?
Yeah, sure. We used to have oil coming in there, and I know I used to go Saturday nights up to Swampscott Beach, because we used to wait in Lynn to go pick up my dad in Everett. And sometimes we'd go to a movie, some friends of ours. Of course, you had to go through blackout curtains and everything to get into the movies. You couldn't have any headlights on your cars. You probably remember that. And then we would go down to Swampscott to a place that was open late at night. We'd go down for ice cream or something. And sometimes you'd go along that Swampscott Beach Boulevard, and it would be so rank with fuel oil that you could hardly breathe. And it would splash up on the, and you'd look out at the water, and there'd be deep oil where they had blown ships up out here.
Oh, my heavens.
And I know Dad was working on the paper at that time on Washington Street. And they brought in a group of men from a big fishing trawler. They brought them into, I don't know why they brought them into the paper, because they weren't allowed to print it. But they came in anyway, and they had been rescued. But they were out there trawling.
These were Americans.
These were the Gloucester men, you know.
Yes.
And all of a sudden up comes the submarine, and they just pointed their guns and things at them. But this particular commander took off everybody off of the boat and brought them into the submarine. Then they took all that food and everything from the trawler. Then they sank the ship. But many of them didn't wait to take anybody off. They were sinking ships out there, you wouldn't believe.
My goodness.
But Dad had a chance to talk to someone, and they said this particular German commander was very courteous, and
how were they recaptured? If the Germans captured them, how were they recaptured?
well, they must have released them. They put them afloat in a boat or something, and they were picked up. There wasn't room enough on the sub for another crew, you know.
Do you remember any incidents in Plum Island or Newburyport during the war?
Nothing particular, just the sinkings of the boats out here. But it was pretty wild out there, and I can remember nights. The house that we were living in at that time, where the Tahitians live now, is on a ledge that goes clear out to the Isles of Shoals. So we'd be wakened at night, you know, with a bed shaking like that, and the windows would rattle where there were depth charges. You could hear those depth charges out there, and you'd see these lights flashing like this, you know. Oh, they were having a wild time out here, but the people, they weren't aware of it. They didn't realize the danger they were in.
Very lucky.
But you see how important the air raid wardens were, and the report centers. And so that got me involved. And by the time I had moved into Boston and working in Boston, of course, down there on Causeway Street near the Navy Yard, you were so conscious of the war. But I think what brought it to a boiling point was one of my cousins was blown up at sea coming across from Norway over here. He tried to get into the service, and he had an illness or something wrong, and he wouldn't be accepted, but he was bound he was going to help. His two brothers were in the South Pacific, and he wanted to do his part, so he joined the Merchant Marines, and he was a member of one of those ships that went across in the North Atlantic and took supplies over before we were actually into the war. His name was George Colby. And his ship was blown up at sea, and I was so angry because I thought the world of him. We were very close. And I was just angry enough so that I said, well, I don't know how good I'll be or what I'll do, but I'm going to go in there and do something. So I was working across from what they called the brick battleship at that time. The Navy quarters were there. And I went across one noontime. Oh, I had already enlisted in the Army. I forgot that. I'd taken my intelligence test and all those things. And through that, and I had been pushed into these Army trucks, you know, with the canvas covering, and they'd cart us across Boston and take us out to Clarendon Avenue.
How did the men feel about women in the Army?
Well, in the Army, I'm not too sure, because except for the driver and one that would help us in and out of the trucks, we didn't meet many of them. We met some officers, of course, that would give you your tests, and some of the doctors and nurses when they had physicals, but we didn't meet the Army, so to speak. Well, I went through all that, and I waited, and I waited, and I waited, and I waited. But I preferred the Navy, but at that time they were not, enlistments were not open for women. But it wasn't too long after that when they opened enlistments for waves, and I hadn't heard a word. Months and months, I said, oh, phooey on them. So I went out on my lunch hour, working across the street. I went on my lunch hour, and I went right over and applied for enlistment in the Navy. So I went through that whole rigmarole, and they were much tougher. Oh, were they tough. You had to have references, and the intelligence test, it lasted almost 4 hours. It was a humdinger. It wasn't on any one thing, it was just to see if you could use your intelligence. Not so much knowledge. Now, I went in with a girl that had degrees and was a teacher, and she failed it because she had learned facts and things out of a book. But for me, who had had all these experiences, and, one thing they asked, if you were rowing a boat, how would you, and the tide was running out and all this, this was simply to see whether you could figure things out or not.
Logic.
And how would you land that boat at the wharf? How would you control that rowboat? Well, I had done that so many times at Plum Island. I'd rowed a boat. Oh, I had that all figured out. You'd run up against tide, beyond, turn around and let the tide bring you down to the wharf. I mean, I knew that. And what would you do in case of fire? How would you escape if you were rescuing somebody, And it was on the comics, it was on geography, it was on every subject you can imagine. 4 hours. Well, I think at that time there were 80 some odd taking it. And then, of course, every day. And by golly, if I wasn't one of the few that passed it, I got a good mark. So but then I couldn't pass the physical because I didn't weigh enough. You had to weigh at least 110 pounds. I couldn't get up to 110 pounds, saved my life. Now look at me, 190. So a girl that worked in the office, well, she worked in photography at the lithograph place. She decided she would also go in, so we were in it together, waiting. We were taking our tests together and everything, and she couldn't get up to 110 either. So finally, her mother sewed weights, and they finally had us come in every so often, once a week, to get weighed. That's all. And finally, we didn't have to get undressed or anything, We just had our dresses on and everything. So her mother sewed little weights on the hems of our skirts. And we went over, we stepped on the scales and we went over just a bit. We were both accepted. And then we had to wait, and then we were notified. So I was notified. I was on inactive duty until I got my orders.
Which was what date?
Oh, that was June 1943. Yeah. Well, my mother and Dad were waiting for me out in Everett. They had driven in from Byfield. And I had gone in from Everett into the North Station on the elevated, the bus and elevated. So they were waiting, wondering how I was making out, So I came back that same way, so I got off the streetcar with a very sad expression on my face, crestfallen as you could imagine. And Mom and Dad watched me come along the sidewalk, and they looked at each other, and, she didn't make it, Oh, I was heartbroken. Dad was watching me, He said, "You made it." I said, "I made it."
Oh, wonderful.
And so I came home, and I was given all these orders of what I had to take with me and all this, so I was gathering all this stuff, but I didn't say anything to the people in town. I said, no, I don't want them to know it until I'm actually in. Well, somehow there were press release got out, and the next thing I knew, my phone was ringing, and everybody, Byfield was so proud of me. I was the only girl, and so I finally got my orders to report to Hunter College in New York for training. I've just come across all of my orders. While I was looking for things here, I came across my orders. I came across a picture from a New York newspaper of our graduating class at Hunter. We were in the football stadium, and of course there were several platoons, and then there was spas, and there were some Marines. So there was several hundred of us that had been going through. So we were all in platoons at parade rest in that hot, sunken football bowl. We stood there for almost 2 hours at parade rest, waiting for the Secretary of the Navy and Madam Shai-Kanshek, who were to come to the first graduation of the waves.
This was the first ever.
This was the first, as far, and there was another group in Iowa who were to be yeomen and storekeepers, and they were graduating at the same time. We were of the specialist kind, and you had to be we were older, and we were, every one of them were experienced working women. You had to be older, and they needed somebody that could take over immediately. So it had to be older girls who worked, who could assume responsibility immediately. Oh, there was this need for us, terrific need at that time. And so we were what they call specialists in our particular work. So I got my orders, and Dad and my mother knew that they were going to give me a big time at the Grange, but of course I wasn't supposed to know it. Well, I didn't pay attention, So we were sitting, I used to have a porch that ran around that house, Takesian's house, a big wide porch with white columns. It was pretty. We were sitting out there rocking back and forth in the rocking chairs, so Dad says, "Well, wouldn't you like to get out of the Grange tonight?" He said, "Your mother and I've got to go because we're officers, and how about coming along?" And I said, "No, I'm leaving in a couple of days." And I said, "I want to spend my time at home. I don't know when I'll get home again." Well, they didn't want to appear too eager, but they were working on me, So finally, he says, "We don't have to stay late." But he says it would be nice. You don't know when you'll get to the Grange again. Well, okay, I went grudgingly, and I went to the meeting, and they always had something to eat afterwards down in what is now the liquor store and the
So the Grange
mini
went upstairs.
They met upstairs, and the dining room was downstairs where Mini Mart and the liquor store is now. So I went down. Eva Jones had charge of it that night. And the tables were all set, and they had bouquets of flowers on the table, which was regular. And one of the tables had been sort of built up, and they had done it on all the tables. They had 3 steps, like in the center, and they had these lovely flowers, and it set it up high. So Eva looked out at the kitchen, and she says, "Grace," she says, "that table down there," she says, "don't you think that those flowers are a little too high?" She says, "because the people won't be able to see each other across." She says, "I think there's one too many steps up there." She says, "You want to take that paper off of there, take one of those boxes out, and then put the paper back, put the flowers down low." And I said, sure, So I went through, and I started taking it off, moving it to change the flowers. And of course, every one of them were watching me. And I took the top layer off, and here was a suitcase. And they all hollered, "Surprise!" I almost went through the floor. So that suitcase, along with the suitcase that Dad had given me, made many trips across country, is some scarred up, I guess you know. Oh, I was just flabbergasted, you know. And they had signed a card. I found the card the other day, and it's just filled, backwards, forwards, on the back, underneath, and everything with signatures, you know. And they were awfully good to me while I was in the service. I heard from different people in town, and at Christmas I'd get cards and little things like potato chips and things which I couldn't get out there. And they keep remembering me, you know. They're awfully good to me.
It's a good town.
Oh, yes. And that Grange, of course, I had been very active in the Grange. I'd held office myself, and I knew everybody. As far as I know, I'm not sure that any of those people still living or not, the ones that I knew so well. They were the nicest people. The real Yankee type, the hometown type, you know. I don't know. I think Eva Jones had just died. I can't remember anybody in that group that's still living. On Orchard Street, if you didn't want to go through the Governor Dummer and down the Turnpike, you cut through Orchard Street because there were hardly any houses on that then, and you could go through there safely, but I don't think I'd want to go through there now. That street, that's wild, all those corners and hills. But
did you ever go in that town hall?
Well, when I went by, all it was a cement, great big hunk of cement on a rise, you know. Well, that's where the safe was. They didn't know that safe was in there, and all it was a remainder of what had been the town hall. The town hall was gone, and by that time they were over in Old Town, and here was this great square standing out there in the middle of the pad of the field, you know. And you went by it, and I remember Dad said that's where the old town hall used to be. I'm not sure. Maybe somebody else can tell you definitely, but it seems to me the town hall went across the street where the man had the cider mill. And
do you remember that cider mill?
The townhouse was part of that cider mill.
Do you remember that cider mill?
I think they were making cider when I went by there. It was kind of run down, but I remember Dad pointing to one part that was 2 stories. And, you know, I think it was sideways to the road, and I heard Dad say, well, that's what's left of the old town hall that was over here. But it wasn't until fairly recent, of course, the town hall, when they discovered what was inside of that, and that was this safe. That's why they built those archives over there. All those papers were in there all that time.
Yes. What about the cider mill that was up here on Forest Street? Do you remember that?
Oh, yes. The one at the corner where Stephen Moore lives now.
The corner of Forest Street and Main Street.
Yeah, there was a cider mill in the back of that.
Can you describe it to me?
Well, it was a pretty...
How was it powered?
Down barn, you know, with a cider press in it.
Was it hand-powered?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it was hand-powered.
And you'd take your apples up there, and he charged so much?
Well, that I don't know, because I was fairly young then, but I remember knowing it was a cider mill. But a cider mill wasn't new to me, because Gary's cider mill was over in Middleton, outside of Lynn, and we went over there every fall for their russet cider, and that was a place that was hand done. But the people would come, you know, there'd be big mobs there around in October, November. So seeing a cider mill wasn't that new to me, but I remember people would say that he was still pressing cider. But I never went in there, but I know there was a wreck of an old tumble-down building, you know, what was left of a barn or something like that.
Do you remember any of the big storms in town, or big fires, or...
Well, I slept through with the whole fire we all did when the woolen mills burned down. I guess you know we were some discussion about that. And the bakery burned down. That got on fire where Senior made the bread. And then,
Do you think it caught fire because of his ovens, maybe?
Yeah, that he had, there was some oil or grease or something that caught fire in the middle of the night. And that was, I saw that fire.
And that was located where the present fire station is?
Yeah. And then...
where did they house the fire station prior to the...
I don't know. I don't think we had any. We didn't have any lights, and Frankie was responsible for getting lights in town. And of course Frankie was responsible for the establishing of the only place where there was an engine was at the snuff company. They had their own fire department, and if there was a fire, they went out from there. The snuff company. And then, of course, where the post office is now and where the boots were made for the gold miners in California, and it had been made wooden pegs, I think, in there, and they made all kinds of things over the years. That was, and there was a store finally, and an apartment. People lived up on the top floor. It was a 2-story building then. And they had a bad fire there, and they had to get the people out the windows and got them. They saved their lives, and that's what happened to that building. That burned down also. But
it's curious to me to see there's been a lot of changes, and yet there's a lot of the old family still living.
Yes.
Right here.
They stayed generation after generation.
So there's an underlayer of stability.
Yeah. There are roots here among some of the families. But I think this was during the war. To me, was one of the most exciting things I ever did. I think I told you that I was home on leave, and the reporters were busy. So the editor, who I had worked with for many years, he knew I was home on leave because it came out in the paper. So he called me, wanted to know if I'd help him out. He said, I hate to do this, Grace, but he says, we've got so many things going on tonight. And he says, you know Governor Dummer well. He says, because you've covered so many things down there. And he says, would you help me out and go down and cover the dedication of the new gym? And it was given in memory of a graduate of Governor Dummer who had died in the war. This was still during the war. And the guest speaker was to be Halsey. Admiral Halsey. 5-star admiral yet. He said, you will know how to cover it, and we know you're in public relations, so you're working right along and everything, but you would be ideal to cover that. Would you do it for us? And I said, sure, Then I got to thinking, I thought, boy, that's difficult. Through my experience of writing, I learned that when there was a guest speaker, you naturally want to listen to what the speaker is saying and pick out highlights. You've got to remember all those things in addition to covering the whole affair all around it. And you can't enjoy what people actually say. You're so busy trying to pick out high points and statements and interesting things that you aren't aware of the whole thing as a whole.
Do you remember the approximate, you said it was during the war?
Yes, I was home on leave, It would be 40, it must have been 44. I was in uniform. Yeah, I was home on leave. It must have been 44. I'm not sure, but it must have been. And so I said, gee, most speakers of that quality, that have a transcript of their speech, and they make copies of it. So I said, gee, he was a house guest of Ben Pearson over there by the snuff mill. This was old Ben, this Ben's father.
Yes.
So I said, gee, I think, by golly, I was right across the street, so I said, I knew Ben. So I said, I'll call Ben and see if he can get a transcript of that speech from Admiral Halsey. At that time, I was only a seaman first class, and a 5-star admiral, but of course I had interviewed admirals on the base, but not Halsey. Oh, wow. So I called Ben, and I said, hey, Ben, will you help me out? I says, I've got to cover this thing tonight. I says, can you ask the admiral if he has a transcript of his speech? And if I could get a copy of it, then I could actually get the rest of the program, and I could sit and enjoy it. Well, he says, why should I ask him? Why don't you ask him yourself? I says, Ben Pearson, I could choke you. That's the last thing I wanted to do. And he laughed, and I heard the admiral laughing, And he came on the phone, he says, well, young lady, what can I do for you? And I said, oh, Admiral, I never meant to bother you. I said, I'm home on leave, and they've asked me to cover the dedication tonight. And I said, I called to see if you had a transcript of your speech. I said, I'd like to listen to it. I'd like to. And he said, why, I think that can be arranged. He says, yes, I've got 2, 3 here. He says, I'll have my aide get that ready for you. And he says, I don't think we'll have any problem recognizing you. I'd be the only one there in uniform, He says, by all means, young lady. And he said, what do you do in the Navy? And I said, I'm in public relations. Well, there shouldn't be any problem for you then. I said, well, no, not exactly, I was talking to Halsey of all people. He was just, well, I found out in my 3 or 4 years, the bigger they were, the nicer they were. Mm-hmm. We had the most trouble with the ensigns.
Yes.
And so when I went down, of course, I caused quite a commotion. I walked into that crowded gymnasium, in my uniform. And it just so happened I had my dress whites home with me. So I was all in white, white uniform. And I walked in and I never got used to that. Everywhere we went, everybody, you were like a celebrity. And of course I met quite a few people that I knew through writing.
Who was the headmaster then?
Eames.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Or was it Wilkie? I guess it was Mr. Wilkie. It was I think, I think. Oh yes, of course a lot of the students,
yes,
when they reached the age, away they went.
Yes.
And I remember covering one of the graduations, and what was the name of the man that built all the LSTs? I remember the Christmas fair over at the South Byfield Church. If you went there about 3/4 of an hour or an hour beforehand, you had all you could do to get in the door. Oh, their Christmas fairs were marvelous. And their suppers, they didn't have the hall that they have now. Now they can take care of big crowds, and they've got a modern kitchen and they've built onto that parish house. But in those days, they used to have their suppers in the basement. Their food was famous. They'd come from New Hampshire and everywhere to their suppers, and they held usually once a week.
How about the Methodist Church? Did they have
they didn't have
Christmas fairs?
But they had fairs, but they didn't go into it the way they did. Over there they decorated and, but here they would put up a few tables and things like that. But it was pretty hard for them to hold a supper here. They didn't have any running water. They didn't have any kitchens. They used to have to bring the water in buckets, and
so it would be the Grange that had the supper.
The Grange would try to have some suppers up here, in the square, but they also didn't have running water. It made it very difficult, but those women could turn out the nicest suppers, and everything's so hard for them. That water would all have to be taken down in the woods and dumped, and they'd have to bring it in kettles, and they had Well, in some cases they had the old black iron stoves, and I don't see how they ever did it, but they used to turn out the most marvelous suppers. I don't know how they ever did it. And they had 2-3 settings, because they didn't have the room.
Now,
they didn't have Faith Hall.
There was a well right behind the Methodist church, wasn't there, that the Yellow School used before they had running water?
Yes, and they used to have the privies out back, and they had a well over the South Byfield, too. They used to have to go out, and they had a platform that went out the rear door, and the platform was built out over the ground and down to the well, and they used to have to draw all the water from there.
My goodness.
Took a lot of hard work. Those women worked awfully hard on those.
Do you remember the well right here in front of the Yellow School?
No, I don't. I don't remember seeing the well. I don't think it was in front. I think it was over back toward, if I remember correctly, Harris Rogers lived that first house on the left coming down, what's the name, Church Street. It seems to me it was between the church, the schoolyard, and his house, if I remember, but I never went out there, so I don't know. But I remember we had the principal of the Byfield School living with us.
What was her name?
His name was Ralph Murray.
Uh-huh.
And he had a room. He lived with us. And we had 2 of the school teachers. We had Mary Stein and Eleanor Buckley. And we had a big house. That's a big house where the Caucasians lived.
Yes.
So we had extra rooms. So they not only they roomed and boarded, we fed them too, because they didn't have any place to live.
What was the year?
38, 39, somewhere. And the graduating class from Byfield Grammar School, a big class of 7. Oh, I guess you know. Well, they used to put on, they'd give readings, they'd have songs. They had the graduating class put on the entertainment, and that town hall would be jam full, and peonies. Oh, it had to be peonies in June, the whole place would be banked with peonies. And the girls would wear white dresses and the boys in their suits, We had one boy that went through that didn't have money enough for a suit, so the town bought him a suit and everything, so he'd look like the other boys. And I think that year was a banner year. We had 8 graduates. And so Ralph, Ralph still comes down here. Everybody in town knows Ralph and his wife Harriet.
Ralph?
Yeah, Ralph Murray.
Ralph Murray.
And over across where the Bells live now, that was Evan Woodman's house. And they boarded Harriet Werner. And Ralph and Harriet got married. And we went way out beyond, I don't know, we were on this side of Boston, way beyond Dedham, out that way somewhere when they were married. The 3 teachers and my mother and I went in one car and we traipsed way out there to their wedding. Hot, oh my gosh, it was in June, last of June. But Ralph was like, his sister and my mother were in the Rebecca Lodge together when we lived in Lynn. And his mother was dead and his sister had brought him up. And so he came from Lynn. So when he came to Byfield as the teacher and the principal, my mother heard about it, and knowing the family, why he was the first one, the boarder that stayed with us. And, well, he was just like a son. He called my father Dad, he called my mother Mom, and I was his sister, And he lived with us for quite a few years, and, he was just like having a son in the family, He and Dad would build summer houses, and so this particular graduation with the 8 people, they were dramatizing a story that had you know. Sure, just like that left me. What's the big green animal that's in your imagination? Dragon. It had a dragon in it. So out on our kitchen floor, here was Ralph down on his hands and knees, or sitting on the floor, constructing a dragon. He had built a form of a dragon, and then he covered it with green felt. He made the face and the eyes and the stuff coming out. We all got in on that. Our whole kitchen was a great big dragon. And they had a play. They put on a play. And they had Dr. Page was the superintendent of schools. He had West Newbury and Groveland and Byfield and Old Town. And when he made speeches, he made a speech. Bad day. It was raining, heavy fog, and none of us had ever seen the Statue of Liberty, and our hearts were broken because the New York Harbor was just socked in. We got onto the ferry boat, and we felt awful, because 16 of us, counting me, we got onto the ferry boat, and that caused quite a furor among all the people on the ferry boat. And, we felt awful. When we knew we'd be going by Staten Island, we knew the Statue of Liberty out there. We wanted to see that so bad. And the people aboard the ferry, they said, what a shame, you girls going across and you're not going to be able to see it. They all felt bad for us. So we looked kind of down, and our eyes kind of filled up with tears, because we knew very well none of us would ever be there again. And just as we got to the Statue of Liberty, it was just as if God had reached down from the heavens and pulled two curtains apart like that. Fog all around, pulled like that, and here was the Statue of Liberty. The sun was above the fog, and the sun laid right on her, and she was just as clear as a bell. We stood there and cried, you know. There's something about that makes everybody cry anyway. But we just stood in that ferry boat, and we saw her just as plain. And everybody, isn't that wonderful? And they were all clapping, you know. And we were standing there, the tears rolling down here. We were all so pleased, because these girls had come from the Midwest, and, you know, I mean, they had never seen, I never had. We saw her and went right back together again. I thought it might, we wanted that so badly. I said, so help me. It's just as if he just leaned down and separated these curtains, and there she was, and then the curtains went back. We saw her just as plain. Oh, I can still feel that. Oh, but we didn't know what was ahead of us.
Yeah.
So when we got into St. Louis, the girls were all sick, but they stood watches. They were, they were game. They were a wonderful bunch of girls. And she said, I don't care what anybody says. She says, I'm letting these girls out 2 or 3 at a time. They can't stand it. This was the 3rd or 4th day. They hadn't been out of that car. So she said, you take 2, 3, I'll take 2, 3. And she says, the rest of you girls stay here. You're on your honor, that's an order. Yes, ma'am. They didn't try to get off. So we take 2 or 3 of them and walk them around in the station. And then they bought some magazines, they bought some fruit and some candy. They hadn't had anything but cream chicken for 3 days. Honestly. You had to let a few into the dining car, and then I'd have to sit with the man that ran the dining car, and I had to sign chits, and I had to sign my name, and meanwhile our luggage had gone to California. So we were in our original clothes the whole day and night, never took them off all that time, and with open windows. And of course they were steam engines until we got way out into the Midwest. So you can imagine what we looked like. We were filthy. And so finally, when she got off at St. Louis, she called Washington, called Bupper Navy Department and told what the conditions were. She says, I've got a car full of sick girls here. And she told about the heat and no water, you know, and the food. Well, the orders came through that by this time we had shifted trains 3-4 times. We didn't know what train we were on. They'd take our car and move it and set us out in the hot railroad yards. One place down in there, we had to pull all the curtains down on this side of the car because standing right next to us was a whole carload full of German prisoners. They were also out in the yard. And we sat there in that blistering heat. You know how the rails draw heat. Oh. So anyway, they called the railroad people on the carpet, and I guess you know they were in trouble. And then we were picked up by the Southern Pacific or whatever it was, and we went through Missouri, and it was at the time of the floods. We were the last train across. We just crept across. The water was already coming over the rails, and they took that great long train of about 80 or 90 cars, just crawled across there. And they let us out on the back of we were the last car as usual. They let us out to look, you know, and there was the river, it was the Missouri River, I guess, and it just looked like one huge lake, you know, the houses, everything, all afloat. And one of the girls lost her hat, and the last we saw of it, it was floating down that river.
Finished.
But when we got out to Hutchinson, they had a cattle car at that time, a great long cattle car, and you had to be boosted into it, and it had 2 wooden benches that ran the whole length of it, and it would build up halfway so that the cattle could put their heads out. So that was our transportation at the time.
Wow.
And the sailor that was driving the thing